My mother's name was Lumna, and my grandmother's name was Lola. I grew up with my mom's parents, and she lived with us on and off throughout my life. At the point where this story begins, she had only recently been released from a nearby mental hospital where she had spent the better part of a year. After her release, she came to live with us. Throughout my early childhood, I watched my mother fall from grace. When I was 7, she was a functional and independent woman working as a waitress. She was a beautiful, loving, and intelligent person who I spent Christmases with and played board games with. By the time of this story, just 3 years later, she was a completely different person. She had become a brain-damaged addict who thought she was Paris Hilton. She shaved her hair and eyebrows and wore blue contact lenses 24/7 until they caused an infection. Her unpredictability was something to fear. To make things worse, when Mom moved back in, she started drinking heavily. She would sneak vodka and giant bottles of wine into her room in her backpack. She mixed it with lemonade and sipped it alone until her inhibitions broke down and the psychotic episodes began. I have no idea how the alcohol affected her medication, if her medication even worked, or if she was even taking it at all. I wouldn't have even noticed her drinking it if she hadn't made it our problem. The night before History Day was a perfect example of what I mean. Fifth graders would write an extensive report, make a presentation, and build a display about a historical topic of choice. I was one of the few winners of our class that made it to the regional competition. I may have even gone to the state level if it wasn't for the disadvantage I had. This project was very important to me. Before the events of that night, I had spent weeks doing painstaking research, writing, and going to a university library to look at microfiche articles and check out awkwardly translated books from the 5th century historian Thucydides. Due to an obsession with the movie 300 and a love of Sparta, I chose the Peloponnesian War, the war between Athens and Sparta. The Empire, Earth, and Sid Meier's Pirates. Games inspired my early passion for history. I even built a display board from scratch with no help from family. Unlike the other kids, I had to print text and photos from the public library because even in 2006, my grandparents didn't have a word processor and we still had 56 kilobytes I say per all second of this to emphasize just how much my mom hurt me and sabotaged my hard work that night. I had already worked until 8 or 9 p.m. perfecting my board before bed. During my work, I could hear disturbing sounds from my mom's room. My stomach was writhing with anxiety, but I held on to the hope that her behavior would die down. Please, not tonight, I thought. Later that night, during my bedtime routine, Grandma rushed me and turned her head to hear my mom speaking in a demonic language in her room. Grandma approached her door. "Lumna, who are you talking to?" As always, my mother would reply, "I'm on the phone," probably lacking the energy to question this. My grandma politely asked her to stay quiet because I was going to bed and had a big day the next day. She also asked her other near nightly question, "Did you take your medication?" "Yes, I took my medication," my mom screamed like a spoiled teen throwing a tantrum. "Now leave me alone and stop telling me what to do, Lola." Calling my grandma by her first name was just one of the many ways my mother would distance herself and show disrespect to her loving and caring mother. Grandma was stunned for a moment but seemed to accept her answer. Grandma has always been the shining light of love throughout the course of my life, and each night she would pray with me, sing to me, and give me a kiss goodnight to soothe my shaken spirit. This night was no different. When she was done, I watched her leave through my door down the long hallway. At that age, I would leave the door partially open due to my fear of the dark. As I watched my source of security disappear around the corner, I could hear the hostile grunts of my mom cursing under her breath. "Please, not tonight," I thought again. Over the next hour, the muttering turned to grumbling, which grew in volume and deformed in tone. until it resembled the demonic ramblings of the possessed. This woman needed an exorcism. Most of what she said was difficult to make out, but all of it was base and darkly sexual in nature. From what I could make out, there was a massive emphasis placed on sexual supremacy and body shaming and insecurity. Sometimes she would speak in her normal voice, and other times she shifted into a gurgling, unnaturally low tone. I thought she was channeling demons. She's fat and ugly, she barked. Oh, please no, I begged God. My heart raced. Sleep wasn't coming anytime soon. She croaked out her hellish projections like she was impersonating a stereotype of evil. Of course, the stupid fat bitch is jealous I'm skinny and my tits are bigger than hers. Her voice had a contorted quality that made me imagine words accompanied by uncontrolled body movements. I sat there listening for what seemed like a very long time, listening to things escalate and wishing they would stop. Up until now, none of the things she was saying were that out of the ordinary. Her episode was just unfortunate timing. Audibly talking shit about other women into the mirror in her room was something she did almost every day. Even worse, she would even say such things to random women in real life when we went out to restaurants, school functions, or events. But things would soon Something go far shifted in that normal. Next moment as I had pulled my covers up to my nose. It was like the polarity in the air changed. An electric current zipped up my spine. In that moment, her voice took a dark form that I only rarely heard emerge from deep within her throat. It started with a low, rumbling growl, slowly building in volume over the course of a minute. It was carnal and animalistic. In her deepest guttural roar, her voice shook the walls. "I'm Satan," she bellowed. I quivered beneath the covers on the top of my bunk bed. Only my eyes peeked through. I locked them on the well-lit hallway, hoping to be ready for things to escalate. Violent movements could be felt through the walls, tumbling and falling, accompanied by demonic whining. Her cries pierced through the layers of wood and sheetrock, which separated our rooms by mere feet. It was a storm of hostility and rage. I could hear my grandfather muttering to my grandma up the stairs around the corner at the end of the hallway, but neither one of them came down. At the time, they probably assumed they would only make things worse and should wait it out. The screams eventually stopped, but the gravelly muttering continued like an endless loop of infernal mantras. Every sentence had at least one word she would radically emphasize in pitch and volume, and each time I would recoil with fear. Over the next hour, her grumbling died down in ferocity, but I still wasn't nodding off. My instinct was right, it wasn't over yet. To my horror, the volume and hostility of her uttering grew once more. I flinched at the awful sound of my mother leaving her room. Her continuous rumble morphed into the kind of harsh, sharp whisper that slices through the air and touches your ears from a distance, like something from a horror film. I shook in place and my gut dropped as I watched her terrifying shadow come shambling toward my door. I peeked over the side of my worst nightmare had dissociating. The surreal sound of my door slowly creaking open and the light from the hallway then poured in. She was cast in shadow. All I saw was a black silhouette. I pretended to sleep but continued to watch, transfixed. Next, I could feel her face looking up toward me as she continued to mumble and whisper. I listened closely to try and make out what she was saying. All of it escaped me until I heard her whisper my name. I had never been more afraid in my life than I was in that moment. I could see the shadow of something in her hand, and I was mentally preparing to be murdered in my own bed by my mother. But something must have switched in her mind. She continued to stand there for a minute or so after I heard her whisper my name before finally turning around and then shuffling back to her room. A wave of relief washed over me after that. I made the calculated decision to give up on sleeping in my room and attempt to escape to my grandparents' room upstairs. But there was just one problem: I was trapped. My room was at the end of a long hallway, and my mom's room was one room up and directly neighboring mine, essentially blocking me in. In order to make it, I would have to dart by unseen and unheard. I waited a few minutes before creeping down the ladder of my shaky bunk bed, which creaked with each rung I stepped down. I slowly walked down the hall. As I whizzed by her room, time slowed as I turned to look through her open door. The image burned into my mind's eye. Her room was dark but dimly lit by a single candle.